Hello everyone, today we're going to talk about origin stories. This is the beginning of our second unit of our class, and it really starts to take a sort of different approach than the first unit, where the first unit was laying down foundations of what anthropology is, as well as talking about a really critical concept of culture. We now are going to talk about the origins of humanity across time, and particularly in this first lesson or two, thinking a lot about the biological origins of humanity. And I think that's really important to consider both the biological and cultural side of humanity as sort of two sides of the same coin, but sides that affect each other. I sometimes compare this to hardware and software, with the biology of human bodies being the hardware, and with our culture, our social understandings, our meanings, our ideologies being the software. And so if I have a computer, I'm not like a computer genius here, so if I explain this crappy, please forgive me. But if I have a computer and I have, a tremendous amount of a really good processor, speed, really good RAM, large amount of storage capacity, all of that good stuff, good graphics, good screen size, and yet if all I'm running on there is, Windows 97 or something preposterous, or if all I ever do is use my word processor, I'm really not getting much out of the machine, right? And conversely, if I have all this really fancy software and then I try to download it into a computer from like 2001, it's probably not going to run terribly well. Thankfully, I guess, for us as a human species, our biological side and our cultural sides have kind of developed hand in hand. And so a lot of what you see in the human species is this complex, delicate interplay between our hardware and our software, our biology and our cultures. And so today we're going to be kind of getting into the biological side of our origins. And I want to ask you a question in that regard. What I want to ask you is, why do we love origin stories? You know we do, right? We all do. Whether it's superhero movies like Batman Begins, how many times do we need Batman's origin stories, and yet we go to the movie theater over and over again to see it? I love Batman, by the way, he's my favorite hero. Or this book, which was the #1 national bestseller for a while, 1776, which gave a very in-depth look at the year in which the US really split from Britain. Whether it's, religiously speaking, most religions have some kind of an origin story, both for their religion, and many have some kind of origin story for the world. We want origin stories even of things like the current British monarch, right, with the popular Netflix show, The Crown. And so we love origin stories, and I want you to think about why. Why do we love origin stories? And for me, as I think about that question, part of what comes to my mind is that the past produces the present, at least partially, right? If we know how something began, we oftentimes get some sense of where it is today, and perhaps even some sense of where it's going. So in that regard, we're all, I think, really interested in human origins, both the origins of humanity as a whole, and also the origins of ourselves, right? I think ultimately when we're asking big questions like where did humanity come from, we're really asking a much more personal question about where did we come from and where do we fit in with all of that. And I think you can see that with the rise of all these sort of at-home genetic testing kits that you've probably seen lately, like 23andMe, which I'm not like sponsored by or anything. I'm not advertising for them. This is just a little screenshot of an ad they did. You have these at-home genetic testing kits, which the reliability of this from an anthropological perspective is kind of sketchy. Well, sketchy is probably too strong of a word. There's some complexities here. And we would say that probably these don't work as well as people think they do as far as narrowing down the regions they're from, partly because that the genetics of a specific region are so fluid. But in any case, people pay good money to do this genetic testing to learn that, you're 50% from Ireland and you're, 30% from North Africa, and you're 20% from, this part of Eastern Europe, and people feel, rightly or wrongly, like they're connecting with something. And I guess I want us to think about what is it that we feel like we're connecting with. And I think part of that is we're trying to gain a sense of what our own purpose is by reflecting on where we came from in sort of the human genealogy. And so we've been wondering for a long time about human origins, and that goes back way further than, 23andMe or other DNA tests. This goes back for really as long as I think there have been human beings. Cultures across the world have a variety of stories about human origins. In fact, you read one of them for this module I had you read an excerpt from the Dene Bahane, which is the Navajo emergence story. And so the Navajo emergence story tells a story of a group of beings who eventually become the holy people, who then eventually sort of give rise to the Navajo people. But it tells the story as these holy people go from a lower world, the first world, the black world as it's being represented here, like as in like it was covered with darkness, and then progressively move from this lower world to upper world. So the idea is that there's sort of worlds stacked on top of worlds, and so you move from the lowest world to the next world to the next world, and then finally you enter the fourth or the fifth world, depending on the version of the story, which is where we currently exist. And it's a beautiful, complex story, and there's a lot to it, but as you may have noticed in it, as the group of people, as these holy beings are moving through the different worlds, there's a theme here where they become progressively more in control of their actions. So they keep getting sort of asked to leave each world because of actions that they take which cause contention and conflict with their neighbors. But then as they go on, they get better at abstaining from those types of negative actions, such as having affairs, and they're able to stay in places longer. They also, as they go along, learn some really important lessons, some of them pretty hard fought, which we could get into another time, including sort of lessons about the duality of gender and why there's both genders, and also why they have Nalehi, which is sort of a third gender category within Navajo thought. You also have... So anyways, as you have these holy beings, though, moving through the worlds, you'll notice that they're interacting with animal beings, the air people, as they're calling them in the first part of the story, who are things like insects. And you have, as they move along through each world, they interact with different sorts of beings, insects or birds or different things, who can talk to them. And so it's a time period where humans and animals can communicate with each other. And it kind of bears witness to the fact that within a Navajo cosmology, to some degree, the animals are people too. They're just a different kind of people, which is why you'll occasionally hear Navajo people talk about five-fingered people to signify humanity. Because, of course, there's other kinds of people too. They just don't have 5 fingers, so to speak. So the Dene Bahane tells a rich story about how Navajo people came to be as a people. It is a different story, though, than the story we're going to tell today about human biological evolution. And so that is a story that's very common as well now. And so my point is, every culture has one, if not several, different ways of explaining where humanity came from, or where they specifically came from. And these stories can differ wildly. We tend to think of them as sort of competing explanations of the origin of the world or the origin of humanity, but we should understand that in a lot of cases, these stories are less so competing as they are oftentimes kind of just different in nature. One of the ways in which they're different in nature is that these different stories, whether scientific, sacred, or other kinds of origin stories, have different purposes, different reasons for which they're told. The Navajo creation story, or emergence story, among other things, establishes who the Navajo people are in relation to their landscape, establishes foundational moral truths about gender, about animals, about care for creation, about the importance of planning and the importance of social order and harmony. The evolutionary story we'll tell today doesn't really attempt to do all of those things. Instead, it's trying to explain where human bodies came from and the organic processes by which this occurred. These different types of stories also differ in how truth is determined, or we might better say sort of the evidence on which the story is based. So for example, in that Navajo story I was telling, the evidence, so to speak, is the fact that this story has been transmitted from generation since time immemorial. And so to some degree, the evidence for it is the fact that it goes back to antiquity, and that it's connected to a way of life and a set of ceremonies that have been deeply important for Navajo people over the years. And I should stress at this point, by the way, that there's plenty of Navajo people who would not use this story and instead use evolution to explain things. And there's also plenty of Navajo people that would, for example, that are Christian and would use like the Genesis account to explain things rather than this traditional story. So there's diversity within a society, but we'll circle back around to that in a minute. Different origin stories differ as well in terms of what forces exist. So for example, in this Navajo story, at various points you have supernatural beings, beings that do things in the story that drive the story forward that don't happen in what we can, in sort of normal everyday life. So for example, at one point, an incredibly important sacred being named Changing Woman is shedding off pieces of her skin, and those become the different Navajo clans. It is a beautiful part of the story. It's also a part that anybody would obviously recognize. Well, this isn't something people normally do in everyday life. They don't, take off a piece of their skin and have it become a people. But she's a supernatural being, right? Within the scientific account of evolution, it is couched within the general sort of Western, and not just Western, but at this point global scientific model, where we assume uniformitarianism. And what I mean by uniformitarianism is that physical laws as they currently exist in the universe are what have existed in the past and what exist across the universe, right? So gravity is always a factor. The conservation of matter is always a factor. Cause and effect is always a factor. And furthermore, sort of the scientific narrative acknowledges or holds to something has to be empirically observable, at least in theory. That gets pretty shady when we start talking about things like theoretical physics, but at least in theory, the phenomena has to be physically observable if we're going to use it in our explanation. Whereas in sacred origin stories, there are often beings or forces which cannot be seen. So the different types of forces that can exist, the different way in which the story is based, the different purpose of the story. Finally, though, so this can sometimes lead us to a point of view where we see the different types of origin stories across the world as in competition or in conflict with each other. And certainly many times we've seen this play out, right? So for example, in the Scopes evolution trials of the 50s, debates over whether or not evolution should be taught and how it should be taught in school that were raging at the time in the 1950s in the US is just one of many examples. One other point I want to point out too is that origin stories may differ in terms of how literally people interpret them. And so it is not necessarily the case that every Navajo person who's heard this story that we were just talking about interprets it as the literal emergence from lower worlds of the holy beings who then give rise to the Dene people. And in fact, there are definitely Navajo people who view this as more of a metaphor for what archaeology seems to tell us, which is the idea of Athabascan and eventually Navajo people coming across the Beringia land bridge area, or Beringia area, extending down through Canada and eventually migrating into the southwest. And so there's people that sort of, Navajo people that see the sacred origin story as more of a metaphor, a sacred metaphor, an account of what was happening archaeologically, or see them as kind of going hand in hand. And then presumably there would be Navajo people that have abandoned traditional story altogether and don't reconcile because they don't feel the need to, because they are fully accepting that scientific narrative. That is true in the Abrahamic religions as well. So Genesis posits a creation of 7 yams, which is translated typically in English Bibles as days, although it's debatable whether that could also refer to just a general period, which is kind of where the rub comes in, right? So there are believing Christians the world over who see the Genesis creation story as a literal 7 days of creation. And then you also have believing Christians, including Christian people who are, for example, evolutionary scientists, who see Genesis as metaphorical, or perhaps see it as not metaphorical, but in a sense harmonizing with science. And so people differ with how literally they interpret their cosmologies, how literally they interpret their origin stories. But it's interesting, though, that we all try to, whatever the different ways that we try to come up with, whatever different sources of evidence we use, whatever different purpose, that we all seem to do this. We seek to know about where human beings came from, or at least where we came from. Specifically, our family roots, generally, the roots of our people, and as a species. So I think it's interesting to ask, why do we want to know about human origins? And maybe pause the video here and write down 3 thoughts about why we want to know about human origins, why that might be useful information. Well, I think among other things, it can be useful information in the sense that by thinking about human origins, we can learn a whole lot about humans today in terms of by thinking about where we've biologically come from and where we've culturally come from, we can think about sort of what is human nature, what is actually part of our hardware versus what has become part of our human lives over time because of choices made by those who have come before us and those who are around today. Now, as we talk about human evolution, I want to clarify what my goal is and what it isn't as your professor. This is a survey graph from 2013 by the Pew Center, and they surveyed American adults about whether they thought that humans have existed in the present form since the beginning of the Earth or have evolved over time. And as you can see, the United States American public, at least in this survey, were split with the majority holding to evolution, but a large minority holding to something different. Presumably many of these people, especially considering the religious demographics of the US, are probably believing in creationism, the idea of God or a higher being having created human beings unilaterally without evolution. So my point in showing this graph is a couple of things. Number one, students in this class may have a variety of different strong feelings about where human beings came from. Some of those viewpoints may be very pro-evolution. Some of those viewpoints may be very anti-evolution. I am not, as an anthropologist of religion, I am not ignorant of this fact that people might have a variety of opinions about this topic. And I certainly understand it and I certainly respect it, especially as somebody that comes from, I would say, was raised in a relatively conservative religious tradition. I very much get this and want to respect and honor different origin stories. As a cultural anthropologist, it's cultural relativism. We want to honor why people believe different things. And so I'm not here to discredit origin stories of any given culture. It is not my job, nor do I desire to sell you on evolution or make you, quote, believe in evolution. That is not my goal here, nor is my goal to make you disbelieve in any other sort of origin story, which may also be incredibly valid and important for you. My purpose, simply put, as an anthropologist, is only that you in this class come to understand the scientific consensus on human origins as we understand it right now in 2020. The origin story according to physical anthropologists, which of course changes and our understanding evolves over time about human evolution. But I want you to understand the scientific consensus. Again, you don't need to agree with it, but you do need to understand it, right? That's an important part of taking an anthropology class, and one could argue it's a part in general of just sort of being educated in a society where this is sort of the dominant origin story, right? It's the majority held origin story. So you need to understand it, whether or not you agree with it. For some people's jobs, it's directly relevant. If you're, let's say, going into physical anthropology, or perhaps human genetics, or different things. For a lot of the rest of us, this is not directly relevant to our jobs. And again, that's one reason among many that I don't require you to agree with this paradigm. I am simply saying that it is worth understanding and knowing what it says, whether you agree or disagree with it. For that matter, if you do disagree with it, sometimes it's at least helpful to know what you're fully disagreeing with. So this is kind of my approach as a professor, is sort of a plurality of different views are accepted here, so long as we make sure that we understand what the science says as the scientific community currently holds.